Is-
All right. We are here, the first instance of the Phoenix Friends of Carl Jung doing a short podcast and a clip of one of our recordings. We have Michelle and Will here, who are board members of the nonprofit. And this is the first time we're doing this. So there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be issues with how it flows with the audio clip. But essentially, what we're doing here is we're previewing one of our many recordings that we have available. And we're having members of our community, nonprofit educational group, discuss the clip. We're going to post this on YouTube, and we're going to have links to our website and a place where you can buy the entire clip and other clips that we have. Sorry, buy the entire recording and other recordings that we have, and also peruse our website and see our upcoming events. So essentially, we're doing both a podcast and an advertisement for our group and an advertisement for our recordings. So my name is Elliot Alford. I happen to be the vice president of the nonprofit. Michelle is the secretary and Will's the program manager. Um, we can do introductions at any point, but I would say maybe we just start by listening to the recording and then pausing it. And then whenever Michelle or Will, you want to jump in, just the first time you talk, just give a brief introduction at that point. All right. So, Michelle, why don't you start the clip?
All right, here we go.
I'm going to suggest that if we have some approaches to suffering, if we have a framework for viewing suffering, a way of thinking about it, that it's a little easier to tolerate and easier to bear than if we just think that it's just a kind of random accident that has no particular meaning and it's just part of the tragic side of life. So I'm going to suggest some depth psychological and spiritual approaches to it that may be helpful. And later on in the day, maybe after lunch, I want to talk about some painful states of mind which cause enormous, what I refer to as mental pain or silent suffering, that are not part of any particular disorder. I'm thinking of problems like loneliness and envy and chronic alienation, those kind of problems, which cause intense suffering, but they're not particularly dealt with very well in textbooks. So that's the plan. Let me just begin with a little digression into the etymology of the word suffering. It comes from two Latin words. One is sub, which means under, and the other is the verb ferere, which means to carry. So the etymological sense of the word is that one is bearing a burden. And it has a slightly different connotation than the word depression. The word depression means that there's a
Oh, did you want me to stop or no?
Well, let's stop here for a second. So far, I did not want you to stop at that point, but
Okay.
the description of the clip, by the way, is Lionel Corbet talking about suffering with depth psychology and spirituality, which we will have in the description of the YouTube video. That's this clip that we're discussing. So he's obviously so far talking about ways of looking at suffering in a depth psychology and spiritual sense. But yeah, you can continue the clip.
weight on top of you, but you're pressed down by it. But you can suffer in the sense of carrying a burden without necessarily being depressed and without being particularly pressed down by it. It simply means that you're having to carry something. Um, Interestingly enough, this word ferere is also the root of our English word fertile. The implication is that something might grow or come of the suffering, and I want to especially emphasize that aspect of it. Suffering can produce something. The English word has changed over the course of time. You remember in the New Testament, Jesus said, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." And what he meant by that was allow them to come to me. So that was the original meaning of the word. It had the connotation not just of distress, but of allowing something to happen in a patient kind of way. But now it's no longer culturally fashionable to be patient about suffering. We want to eradicate it as quickly as possible. But what I'm going to try and show is that it can be developmentally important for the individuation process. And I'll talk a little bit about the Book of Job as an example. And maybe we can, if you're interested in a digression, we can talk about Jung's answer to Job, which that's an archetypal.
Hey, so feel free to jump in, one of you guys, but I was really struck by how Christianity, to me, in at least my version of Western culture, seems to be one of the only places where suffering is still looked at like patience, like something that you patiently endure. Um, and that was noteworthy to me about what he just said, as well as the fact that I would think that Jung would also say that individuation necessarily comes with suffering as well, which is not always highlighted in the way we think about Jung. Sometimes we look at it more as analysis of dreams and well, maybe listening to podcasts, but not necessarily the suffering part.
Well, what struck me is that, I mean, I agree with you that the patience component does seem to be a hallmark of how you deal with suffering in Christianity. But what struck me was how it's the etymology. It really means that you have to carry it, that it's a burden to bear. And when you think about carrying something or a burden, it does tend to be quite some time that you have to carry it. I mean, when you think of a burden or, something that, well, and he talks about the root word meaning fertile, and if you think about someone who is fertile, they're carrying a child, and that's for some time, it's for a duration. And so I think those two ideas kind of go hand in hand, being patient with your suffering, and that it is an extensive process, an extended process. But I do slightly disagree with him in that it's not something like we think of as that we have to endure. I mean, whenever I think of suffering, I do think of how we have to endure it, not something that, we try to get it to go away as soon as possible. Did you get that? Do you, either of you?
Well, but I do agree. I do think that the trend of culture today is to be more try to get rid of it quickly. I do agree with him in that sense. What about you, Will?
Well, even at the ending, I think what I was really struck by was the question of the answer to the Book of Job. And what that really strikes me is the question of how do we deal with unavoidable suffering or what's inescapable or unchangeable. And yeah, we'll have to cultivate some kind of patience and endurance. How do we go through unavoidable or inescapable suffering, or even the question of meaningless suffering? Job was really confronted with is this? Does this have any purpose or reason behind it, or is it random and meaningless? But I think like we're also getting to, I guess I'm losing my train. Yeah.
And then the question, I mean, that raises the question to me, if you don't have the skill or the propensity to endure suffering patiently, then when you finally get a type of suffering that you have to endure, will you be able to? I mean, and I guess Lionel is about to go into the story of Job, so we can listen to that, and then we'll hear Will's thoughts about it.
He goes into, talking about how it's not necessarily a disorder, but what you were saying is like, I don't think we are taught the skills necessarily to deal with suffering, and so they may feel like disorders.
Absolutely. Well, he's about to talk about Job, I think.
Image of intense suffering that seems on the surface to have no particular reason for it. But let me just say a few words in general about suffering before we go into the details. The first point is that when a person suffers intensely, whatever the original source of suffering is, in the end, suffering affects all aspects of a person's life. It always has physical, psychological, and social components, no matter what the original source is. It affects the opportunities for growth, it affects relationship with other people, it affects mobility, living space, and it has a very important relational dimensions. And one of its most important relational dimensions is that it's often associated with a failure to be understood by other people. So that when people are suffering intensely, you see this, for example, in people who've been in concentration camps. They often despair when they try to explain what their experience was, and many of them are silent because they feel it's impossible to convey what's happened to them. So this inability to be understood by other people adds to the individual's suffering, and it often leads to social withdrawal, isolation. Suffering can make people extremely lonely if it's too difficult to convey to other people what's going on. It makes people feel different from people who are not suffering and alienated from those who have not suffered. The next point I want to make is that it's a mistake to think that suffering always indicates psychopathology or abnormality of some kind. There are many forms of suffering that are not disorders. You won't find them in the DSM, which, the DSM at best is a Boy Scouts manual. But I mean, it doesn't deal with the really important things. But suffering is a normal aspect of human life. It's not an illness. It's not a disorder. There are lots of forms of suffering that don't fit into any category in medicine or in psychiatry. Problems like loneliness and envy and hatred are suffered silently, and they cause tremendous mental pain, but they're rarely talked about. There are situations like being in a job that you hate, a relationship that you hate that you can't get out of, problems like being a refugee or forced migration. These situations cause tremendous suffering, but they're not illnesses or disorders in any sense. So this is on top of well-known problems like grief and loss that cause suffering. We can feel unloved, we can feel abandoned, we can feel empty, we can feel a lack of fulfillment or an inability to express our abilities and talents and so on, a loss of intimacy, or many people just feel a kind of diffuse unhappiness and they can't put their finger on what the reason is for it. That's why Thoreau said, this is a quote, "Many people are living lives of quiet desperation." He says, "An unconscious despair is concealed under the games and amusements of mankind." And nowadays, what's happened to fill that vacuum is the entertainment industry. All our television and social media and video games and movies and so on often act as distractions so that we don't have to be in touch with the intensity of how we're suffering, which I think is one reason that the entertainment industry is so popular. And a lot of this kind of suffering that's masked by entertainment is invisible. Society wants us to have a kind of stoic attitude to it. Just on the surface, behave as if everything is okay, but no matter how unhappy you are underneath. When you're suffering in this kind of way, especially when suffering suddenly begins, you begin to live in a different world than the world you were living in before. All of a sudden, the world becomes insecure and unpredictable and unfamiliar, and suddenly you become aware of areas of vulnerability that you'd previously been able to ignore or deny, or you just didn't realize were there. What happens to people when they suffer intensely is that they become unable to move, unable to do anything. They become passive. They feel as if they are forced to submit to something which is beyond the grasp of their will to change. That's why passivity sometimes occurs and people feel kind of emotionally paralyzed by intense suffering. It also, of course, can destroy hope. It can destroy meaning. Suffering can.
Well, I obviously misremembered the quote because I thought he would talk about Job sooner. But, he seemed to hit on a lot of topics that to me reminded me of addiction, how a lot of people will say the real source of addiction is lack of human connection. And the way to resolve addiction is to rekindle genuine human connection. And I've heard that. I don't know how prevalent it is in psychology these days, but I think the losing of the belief that you can connect with people, the belief that you can share your suffering with people, um, relates to that for me. And then, of course, the hopelessness of the addict that struck me. And then also, I did have a note that if you're suffering and you yourself do not know the reason, which he mentioned, um, I would say that maybe is a disorder, the type of disorder that maybe Jungian um, concepts can help with. If the suffering is literally unknown, that's to me what Jungian ideas can help with a lot that maybe other modalities can't. Whereas being a refugee, losing a limb, as he mentions, those are types of suffering that cannot be avoided and are are just part of life and have always been part of life. But curious what you guys think about that.
Well, I think that the fact that I do get the addiction aspect, but like the part where he says, the desire to be entertained, the entertainment industry is like filling a vacuum. I would say it's more like a balm, I would think, to replace that. I think there is a lack of connectivity between people, and in a way, some of the things that are coming out of arts and culture is a mode of connecting people to concepts that they um, may be familiar with but have never spoken about. And like you were saying, like they may not know what the suffering is about, but I think that is kind of like the leaping off point towards becoming more self-aware. I think sometimes suffering is just not knowing what you don't know yet and figuring out a way to address the issues. And I think entertainment's a way of doing that. So I would disagree with them a little bit on that because I feel like it's more of a balm than like trying to fill a space.
Yeah, I think we're getting at, Freud had a book, Society and Its Discontent, or the social malaise that we are suffering from. And maybe that the key quality, the key feature of the social malaise or the social discontent is alienation, that we're disconnected from ourselves and others, and we're struggling with isolation. And even another term from Eric Fromm would call it the pathology of normalcy, or my mentor would call it the neurosis of normalcy. Viktor Frankl would call it the neurotic triad. Why is depression, aggression, and addiction, and maybe even anxiety now the norm? Why is this normal? Where addiction, depression, aggression, at the heart of it is this emptiness or an existential vacuum. It may not be so severe that would qualify as a DSM diagnosis or disorder. But I mean, addictions can definitely fall under that. There's low grade dysthymic disorder for depression. We got intermittent explosive disorder for anger. So there's definitely certain disorders out there, but it doesn't have to be that severe. It could be a low grade quality, which we're all kind of struggling with collectively. And so I think that's kind of, what I was gathering from that.
Yeah, and I don't think he's condemning social media as an information source or as a potential for community building. I think he's saying that it maybe has unproductive, an oversized influence on society in general, and in particular, when people go down this road of disconnection, it's an enabler. I think the entertainment industry. I think people who are disconnected are going to be more likely to engage more with the modern entertainment system, and that's at least what I think, and I kind of think that's what he's saying
Like
because
it's a faux engagement. It's like you can still isolate yourself and sit at home and feel like you're being engaged.
yeah, and that's like I said, it doesn't mean that you couldn't meet a community of people online that would then reverse that, but it's also saying that just in the modern age, um, that is an enabler of, I would say, this connection. Sitting at home and binge watching a show does not lead to connection unless you then talk about that show with other people, right? But that doesn't happen with this, a sufficient frequency, I would say. All right, so let's continue. Let's get to the next section.
Destroy meaning. And what's very difficult for religious people is that they may have worshipped their God, or whatever tradition they're in. They may have had a certain God image. And then when they suffer intensely, that their religious beliefs and their image of God are radically challenged. They may have prayed all their life and attended churches and temples and so on, and done all the right things. And they may have a God image of a God who's benevolent and loving and so on. And then all of a sudden they're massively afflicted and they ask themselves, why is this happening to me? What have I done to deserve this? Am I being punished? And this was the situation that Job found himself in. Job was an apparently innocent man who suddenly was afflicted terribly with all kinds of losses. Now, when this kind of thing happens, some people turn away from religion in general. This is one of the main causes of atheism. People can't believe that there can be a benevolent, loving God in the face of the kind of intense suffering and evil. That's another related problem that goes on. And so this is a potent cause of atheism. There are also people who will deepen their spiritual commitment when they suffer. It's very interesting how some make a turn towards spirituality, some make a turn away from it. If the individual who's suffering has always been an atheist, then the suffering will very often just confirm his or her view that the universe is cold and indifferent to human beings, that suffering is just meted out arbitrarily. It has no relation to how you behave or who you are or what kind of person you are, that kind of thing. But during a life-changing crisis that produces intense suffering, many people ask whether they can live with what's happened. Will life ever seem meaningful again? And you may have a person who's been very interested in existential questions, or they've been in the back of the person's mind, but they rush to the foreground when suffering arises. What does this mean? Why is this happening? And can I find what Jung would call a new myth, or a new personal myth, a new reason for living? Some way, some story that allows me to, excuse me, to find a place in the world that makes sense of it. I mentioned that our culture tends to see suffering as a bad thing. But in fact, suffering can be harmful or helpful to the personality, to the development of the personality. It can act as a fertilizer or it can act as a poison. For example, a common problem is depression. You can look at depression through a whole spectrum of lenses. On the one hand, if you take a sort of biological point of view, depression is the result of disturbed brain chemistry. You don't have enough serotonin or something in your brain. On the other end of the spectrum, you can see depression as the dark night of the soul. Maybe what John of the Cross called a penetration by a ray of divine darkness, which is intended to foster spiritual development. It's not random and it has a purpose, even though it's awful when you're going through it. So on the surface, it might be difficult to know the difference, but inside, the attitude that the person takes can make an enormous difference. Or again, if you're an atheist, it's just.
All right. Well, we finally got to Job a little bit. I wrote down connecting what he had said previously about vulnerabilities being revealed and then the God image being challenged. In a Jungian sense, and Freudian, I guess you'd say the ego and the God can play a similar role in the psyche. But when the God image is challenged and vulnerabilities are revealed, I see that as a potential opportunity for the ego to evolve, and the persona to evolve, and the shadow to be integrated, and all these things. And then the new myth, that's really an integration also in a individuation process. And he's obviously going into how it can be viewed as a positive or opportunity or a gift. If someone goes through their whole life and they never have any of their own vulnerabilities revealed and they never have their own image of God challenged, then they can't create a new myth. So I think that's pretty clear and very, to me, very Jungian concept. What about you guys?
Well, I want to ask Will a question because he says in this clip that some people will turn away from God when they start to suffer, and some people turn toward God. And I guess in your experience of helping people through traumatic situations or helping people work through those sufferings, what do you think is the difference between those people? The people who may turn away from God when they're suffering or turn towards him? Is that the difference between meaning and meaningless and meaningful suffering?
I would say so. I think that's in a way we're talking about the humanity's curse is really meaningless suffering. We're prepared to suffer if it has a meaning, but if it's meaningless on some level, we might even feel justified in committing suicide. But what's interesting, it's like you'll find in war-stricken areas that there seems to be some kind of correlation that people actually turn when the more danger, the more threatening the environment, the more people turn to religion or a source of meaning for perseverance, for a source of strength to endure. But without that, you may not survive. And I think that's exactly what Viktor Frankl was questioning himself. The people who had the best chances of survival were the ones who had some sort of source of meaning or a reason why life was worth living. And kind of talking about this God image, when we lose our God image, maybe that's the existential crisis of being confronted with meaningless suffering. Why is this happening to me? And to give birth to new meaning with a new God image, to give purpose and a reason to endure. Those who have that are more likely to survive those really dangerous situations. And so hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the root of the word to bear and to endure. If you're going to bear something, you're also going to bring it forth, right? Something new is going to come out of it, something like some kind of growth or development, which creates more meaning, I guess.
Absolutely. And there's the idea of post-traumatic growth. There's post-traumatic stress disorder, but how about post-traumatic growth back in order? And so that holds out for some new hope and purpose, and that there's a reason to continue moving forward.
And an opportunity maybe to reframe it, like Lionel said in the beginning, so that it's not the bad thing that suffering obviously is, but like we can reframe it so that we're getting something out of it. So we know that the way out is through, and it's something that we all have to share.
Right. I think that's huge. Maybe that's the most noblest or the deepest meaning is that we can turn our suffering into a success by how we go through it, the attitude that we give it, and that that's maybe the most important meaning that we can fulfill in our lives. And so, absolutely.
Yeah, and for me, it's just striking this kind of, I would say, modern USA culture that I perceive, where we view, let's say, old Catholic cultures, colonial Catholic cultures. I'm a big Graham Greene fan, so like these cultures where everyone had to be Catholic, you couldn't not be Catholic, and you're in this colonial town. We view those people as really trapped in the religion. Like a lot of people who aren't Catholic, let's say, they view those people as being trapped. But if you read a lot of those novelists, the people aren't as trapped because it seems like as they age and they go through suffering in their lives, they get to a new relationship with the religion. And, I'm let's say, Love in the Time of Cholera, these kind of books that are based in those periods and those times, those people, even in those very constricted societies and where everyone is the same religion, they're able to reinvent their relationship with the religion. And for some reason, that's striking me when we're talking about this, that whatever somebody's personal constraint is, their culture, their society, their family, they can still reinvent their God image. They can reinvent their personal myth, and they can deal with their vulnerabilities and grow from them. So and almost always the cause of that is suffering. And then the result of it is some form of peace or wisdom. So that's just the imagery that was drawing to my mind. The old, middle-aged and older Catholic, basically from a novel, like reinventing their relationship with Catholicism in this example. But
I think Lionel goes into that in a little bit in terms of like this idea we have of God as kind of like a punisher, versus as we start to go through things in life, which I'm very old, so I've gone through some stuff, and I can say personally that my relationship to God has changed because, I've gone through that stage where I thought God was a punisher. You go through these experiences and then you start to give it all up because you realize that all those things you've been suffering through are serving you in some way. And if you have a different perspective about suffering, if you reframe it differently. So I definitely think like those people who are in very ritualistic religions are most definitely reframing their relationship with God as they go through certain things in life.
And maybe that also points that the God image is continuing to evolve. It's never ending or always unfolding. And we're always maybe developing our own unique relationship to that God image. It's universal, but we also have our own subjective and unique individual relationship to that God image. And so why not have some space for growth, development, evolution, and ongoing change and something new? New vitality.
Yeah, I mean, anything that brings newness and growth potentially is good. And yeah, I just think the whole God image, religion, all that stuff is very loaded, the way, at least people in my circles kind of view it. But it doesn't always have to be, I guess, is the thing that I'm thinking right now, is it doesn't always have to be as loaded as we think it is. All right, well, let's continue the clip.
Part of the tragic side of life, and it doesn't have any particular meaning. What happened to Job was that he was I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the story of Job, but he was an apparently innocent man, pious, well respected in his community, very affluent. And one day, God and Satan meet. Satan in those days was still part of the heavenly court. He didn't have the bad reputation that he has nowadays. The book of Job was written about 400 BCE, but it's been referred to by earlier books, and so it probably is the writing down of a long oral tradition, actually. The archetypal problem is of the suffering of an innocent person for no obvious reason. God says to Satan, look at my servant Job, essentially what a good person he is. And Satan says, well, I'm not surprised. He's so good. You've given him so much. He's affluent. He's well respected. I think he had 10 children or something, or 7 or 10 children. I can't remember. If you take away all that, he won't be so good. And God and Satan have a bet about this, about what will happen to Job. This is an extremely terrifying God image for lots of people. The God of the wager. You have to wonder what else in the Bible has been written by this, this kind of God image. Maybe the Ten Commandments were the result of a bet. I wonder if they can handle this. It's like that story of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai saying to the people, I have good news and bad news. The good news is I've got him down to 10. The bad news is adultery is still in. But it shakes a lot of people when you read the beginning of this book about essentially this wager. Anyway, so God says to Satan, okay, we'll take away all his stuff, but don't kill him. So his family are killed in a whirlwind, a storm that blows the house down that his children are in. And then marauding bandits steal all his flocks and herds of sheep and goats and so on, which was the source of his wealth in those days. So all of a sudden, he's completely reduced. He has nothing left. Instead of being angry and upset on the surface, he says, well, we've accepted good things from God and we have to accept bad. And his wife comes to him and says, why don't you curse God and die? And he rejects that advice. That advice is put in there to contrast him with the story of Adam and Eve, because it's in the tradition of blaming women for everything. His wife is depicted as trying to seduce him into cursing God, but he remains patient, which is why we have this phrase in English, the patience of Job. So God and Satan meet again, and God says, see, I told you. And Satan says, well, what if we make him ill? So the next thing that happens to him is he breaks out in boils all over his body. Okay. But he remains apparently on the surface okay with it all, pious and good and so on. Except if you look at it as a depth psychologist, you immediately see that what's happened is that this is a man who's had these huge losses and his skin is erupting now. He's clearly having a psychosomatic skin eruption. Instead of boiling with rage at what's happened to him, the terrible things that have happened to him, he's boiling with anger, but it's coming out as a somatic process because he's not psychologizing it. That's not what the theologians tell you is going on. But that is what's going on if you look at the story psychologically. Everything rolls downhill and ends up in the body if you don't deal with it. So the next thing that happens is his friends come to talk to him, and they insist that he must have done something wrong. Because they have a theology which says that only the original covenant was if you're good, you'll be looked after, and only wicked people suffer, and good people don't suffer. And Job keeps having to point out to them that this isn't true, that wicked people do very well, and innocent good people suffer. And this leads to tremendous conflict with his friends. I won't go into the whole story with it, but they keep insisting on this traditional idea that suffering must be a punishment for sin, in spite of the fact that that doesn't seem to be the case. when I read this, it always reminds me of that story of the psychotic man who kept telling his psychiatrist that he was dead. And the psychiatrist said, "You can't be dead. You're breathing, you're walking and talking." And the man insists that he's dead. So the psychiatrist said, "Well, what if I stick you with a needle and and you bleed? Will that convince you?" He says, "Yes." So the psychiatrist gets a needle and sticks him, and of course he bleeds. And the man looks at it and says, "Well, what do you know? Dead people do bleed." The point being is that when people have a theory or a belief, it's very hard for them to change. So not Job's friends represent this traditional notion that people find it very hard to get rid of, that suffering is a punishment for sin. What happens in the story is that God appears to him in a whirlwind. He has a numinous experience of the divine Yahweh appearing to him in a whirlwind, a storm, which is very important because it was a storm which blew his house down that killed all his family. So here's the very manifestation that caused this suffering now appearing to talk to him. And what happens as a result of the story, and this is what Jung's answer to Job is all about, is that Job has two things have to happen to him. One is that he has to radically change his God image. He says, "I'd heard about you with the hearing of the ear, but now I can see you." In other words, I used to go to Sunday school and they tell me all about you, but when I actually experience you, it's nothing like what they told me, which I think is why Meister Eckhart used to say, God save me from God. If you have a preconceived idea, when you have a direct experience, it may be nothing like what you've been told. So one of the effects of suffering is a radical change in the individual's God image.
Well, he's going back to this idea of God image. I often think about the superstitious belief that bad things happen to bad people. That people, I think a lot of people, once again, maybe just in my circles, they forget that this is how people used to think. And I think that it's interesting in a lot of contexts, like with criminal punishment, is one of the contexts I think about it in. But like, oh, if you got caught, then it's bad. If you don't get caught, then it's okay, right? A lot of people kind of have that belief, and it's an unconscious belief, and I would say that it's a superstitious belief. But I also think, like a lot of stories in the Old Testament, that there actually could be easily just be described as internal psychological processes, like something bad happens to someone and they themselves think it's because I'm bad, even if it's totally irrational to think that. And then the story of Job, it's his friends who are saying that. But if you look at the story as a allegory for the internal struggles, then definitely people do have that ability to think, to blame everything on themselves, whether or not there's any reason to do it. So that's a concept that I think about a lot, and I do think that it's not very prevalent. For example, people don't generally acknowledge that human nature is sort of superstitious, and sort of thinking is very common, and still to this day, that if something bad happens to somebody, it's because they are bad. That's a thought that a lot of people have unconsciously, and it's in a lot of cultures even now. Now, the untouchables of India would be an example. It's very prevalent for billions of people all over the world. So it hasn't gone away, this concept. And it's also an internal psychological concept. Any other thoughts on that last clip?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of this general theme of why do bad things happen to good people? The question of maybe why be good? and the idea of like a new God image, that if there's tremendous suffering, uh, and when we're confronted with, so many people lose a sense of meaning when they're confronted with death or suffering. And how do we reconcile with that? And how can God be an all good, benevolent God to allow all this suffering? The death of a baby, or accidents that seem random. Uh, how do we wrap our minds around that? How do we make sense of that? And why should we be good uh, if that's what we're confronted with? Why be virtuous if this is the way it's going to be?
Yeah, and I noticed that Lionel said he used the example of Job's friends coming to him and, reiterating this superstition that, you must have done something bad to get all this. And Lionel says, when people have a belief, it's very hard to change. But what I think he's also referring to is, Job's friends come to him and say that, but Job says he kind of refutes that right off the bat. And he says, no, no, there are bad people who have great things happening to them, and there are good people who have a lot of bad things happening to them, which kind of shows that he has a belief of some kind, maybe in his view of God, that is just as steadfast and not really going to change anytime soon for him. And so when Lionel says that the first thing that happens through this numinous experience that he has with God, where God comes to him, is that he changes his whole viewpoint of God. I just think that's interesting, because just prior to that, he seems to have had this unassailable belief in God.
Yeah, it's like he had a static God image that
Yeah.
was not alive, and then it changed into a living God image,
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
which
Even,
I think is interesting in this context because Job was a very pious person.
yes. Yeah.
It wouldn't be as interesting if he was a mediocre pious person, I think.
Yeah. What I also think is interesting is the whole bit about the Job getting sick, and Dr. Corbett saying, this is obviously, though theologians don't present it this way, but this is obviously a psychosomatic situation. And that struck me right off the bat, because I've spent years trying to manage some of these, some of the difficulties in life. You try to manage how you choose to respond to them, right? And so I can honestly say that I can be very calm in the face of difficult situations. However, my body still feels it. And I have been myself, attacked with bouts of hives, because I'm not psychologizing whatever stuff I'm going through, but my body can still feel it. And I thought that was an interesting point to make, that even when he's experiencing this suffering and he thinks he's got the mindset and the framework to deal with it, his body's still like, this is still a difficulty for you. You may not think you know what you know.
Right, the body keeps a score, and the body has its own wisdom, and we can't deny the importance of the body, especially when we're talking about something psychosomatic. But even going back to what Elliot was talking about with the new God image, maybe we're also talking about making space for, does God have a shadow? Maybe God is not perfect. What if there is a dark side to God? How does Satan play a role? Is Satan part of the totality of God? And if so, don't we have to make room for that and the wholeness of the God image? And so those are big questions.
Yeah, I think he was hinting at that when he mentioned how the God appeared as a storm, which was the same thing that had destroyed his house. So there is this, like you need to reevaluate your image of God kind of thing, and it can appear negative. I don't know if it's quite as far as God having a shadow, but it's like negative associations need to be triggered and dealt with, I guess, in relation to God. I don't know. I mean, that's really, to me at least, hard to wrap my head around.
Well,
Well, one idea, one thought is like on the light side, take unconditional love. On the light, unconditional love is embracing, accepting, but someone could interpret it from a shadow side of indifference, not caring. And sort of, if there is a God, either God doesn't know that there's suffering, God doesn't care, or maybe God can't do anything about it. And all of those would point to potential shadow qualities of the God image.
right. And maybe this is a good point to segue into the idea that um, you can you can finish listening to this recording if you go to our website and download it. Because I do know that in the next 5 to 10 minutes of this recording, Dr. Corbett does go into, you know, how God transforms in people's minds and Jung's idea of the dark side of God and what the implications that that has for the body of Christianity, since, you know, Jesus basically said, I am love and light. How does that square with God having, you know, a shadow side that allows us to struggle in our daily lives, but maybe not to our detriment? You know, there's a little bit of a darkness to that, but it's supposed to lead us down a path where we are individualized, we have enlightenment. So that is in the rest of the recording.
Where are we at on the minute and second of the recording right now?
21:55.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, and I think we're getting. I think we're getting into that exact question, and we're getting into also, to me at least, the question of, do we have to define God in a way that's shared between people, like, or is really the question, do we have to define God as in each of us individually? And that's where I land on it. It's like and maybe part of this talking about Job and Christianity and the shadow of the Christian God, Yahweh, is really just a way of I don't know if you'd want to call it an allegory and a metaphor for how we personally all need to define God in our own way. It's sort of easy to make fun of the God of the Old Testament, or not make fun of, but point out the shadow. But I would guess that most of us modern people do not really look at God in the Yahweh way. So that's not our starting point. So it's sort of like a straw man in a way, which I think Lionel Corbet admits.
Yeah, I think he basically uses the example of Job, you know, saying when he says that Job's whole notion of God had to change as soon as he experienced him in that, you know, that windy melee, that windy storm. He was like, oh, I thought you were this, and now I see you're this. So I think he's giving a good example of that. Like, we all have to come up with our own definition through our experiences.
Right, I totally, and that actually goes with more of the existentialist point of view, which I actually like myself. That is sort of the idea that there could be a God, but it actually doesn't make a difference if there is a God or not. We still actually kind of have to live as if there is no God, and we have to define and give meaning to life either way. And so, or even Kierkegaard would say, you know, what difference would it make if the truth was right in front of you, or Jesus for that matter? You still have to choose to bring the truth or Jesus into your life and give meaning to that. So it doesn't make a difference whether there is or not. You still have to choose it and define it.
And Corbett just said in that clip, I something like, I thank God for saving me from God.
There
Right.
you go.
And so I think what he's saying is, I thank the lowercase God from saving me from the uppercase God. Uh, I'm using cases, but I guess what I would say, and I have a different spin on it than you will, is I thank my own definition of God from saving me from society's definition of God, is the way I would. But
Right. Well, there's
I
also,
fall on the other side. I actually fall on the other side. I say, in order to survive in this world, you have to have a concept of God. Instead of saying, in order to survive in this world, you have to pretend as if there isn't one, and create your own sense of. I understand the sort of humanist perspective as well. It's all interesting stuff. And yes, the rest of the recording goes into that stuff. All right. Well, this is I thought it was very much what we were intending to do. The flow, it's the first time we've tried this, no rehearsal. We're essentially, once again, we're trying to play a clip of a recording, post a video on YouTube of us going over this clip, also link the recording, promote our group, and promote our recordings and promote our future events. And that's the goal. And I should say, because Lionel Corbet passed away, well, it caused our president to decide to give away all his recordings for free. So this recording is actually free. So for this first podcast type thing, you actually don't have to pay for this recording, anyone watching this. And then I don't want to go without offering chance for people to give a brief introduction of themselves. My name is Elliot Alford. I'm on the board. I happen to be an Arizona lawyer. And what about Will and Michelle? Whatever you'd like to share.
Michelle, you go ahead.
My name's Michelle. I am an armchair Jungian. I am not an expert in anything. I just like to talk about Jung and living and what it means to be alive, and I like to do it with cool people like Will and Elliot.
I'm Will. I'm also a counselor, LPC, licensed professional counselor, specializing in Viktor Frankl's meaning-centered logotherapy. And I think there's a nice bridge between logotherapy and Jungian psychology. I've been a big fan of Jung for many, many years, and so glad to be with all of you.
All right. Well, once again, thanks everybody who may or may not be watching this in the future. Of course, it's our first attempt at doing this as a concept, and this recording is free. We'll have a link in the description, and we have other recordings that are not free, and we have events through our nonprofit educational organization that will be Jungian presenters, as we always have had. We're based in Phoenix. We also have meetup events that are free for community building. It's a really cool organization that we have, and we hope that you guys engage with the organization in one way or another. And thank you for watching.
Let me also just add that you can find the recordings and information about all our events on our website at www.phxjung, so phoenixjung.org.
Awesome. Okay, we can end the recording.
Hold on.